I used to think cheating was something that only happened to broken people in broken marriages. The kind where love turned into a cold war. And the sound of footsteps in the hallway made you brace like you were ducking bullets from a past you chose not to run from fast enough. The kind of homes that smell like secrets and burnt coffee and not much else. But my marriage wasn't broken. Or so I thought. And there weren't any slammed doors or late-night fights. Just the soft silence of familiarity. And a woman who always wore lavender when she kissed me goodnight. From the outside we were perfect. And people said it all the time. They saw the flowers I brought home for no reason. And the way she touched my arm at barbecues. And laughed at my bad jokes. And they said things like, "You two give me hope." Which looking back feels like being congratulated for being the last man to drown on a sinking ship. Her name was Emily. And she had a way of walking into a room like it was hers before she ever took off her coat. I loved her in the way a man loves someone he's seen cry in the dark. And snort laugh during reruns. And I thought that meant something permanent. I really did. But then she started working late. And I told myself that made sense. Because her job was demanding. And promotions don't hand themselves out like candy in July. But there were other things too. Like how her perfume changed overnight. And how she started locking her phone like the launch codes were inside. And how the hotel charges showed up on our shared card with the kind of bold confidence only the guilty can manage. Still I didn't react. Because reacting would make it real. And real meant tearing open the floorboards of a house I thought we'd built together. So I told myself I was imagining it. That I was being paranoid. Or dramatic. Or both. Then my buddy sent me a photo. He didn't say anything. Just sent the picture. And a thumbs up. Like that was all the context a man needs. And honestly it was. There she was. Emily. On a park bench. Laughing with a man whose smile looked like he thought he'd won something. Holding his hand like it was her birthright. And wearing the same dress I'd bought her for our anniversary. The kind of dress that makes you want to believe in poetry. And there was the smile. The one I hadn't seen in months. Not the polite one she gave me at dinner. But the one that made strangers want to take pictures of her. And say there goes a woman who knows happiness. I felt my stomach turn to stone. And my heart to noise. And for a moment I couldn't breathe. Like someone had knocked the wind out of me in a fight I didn't know I was in. But I didn't confront her. Not right away. Because this wasn't going to be a shouting match in a driveway. Or a sobbing breakdown in our living room. No, this was going to be quiet. And sharp. And surgical. I started keeping records. Like I was building a case. Which I was. Because a part of me knew that when you play dumb long enough people start to underestimate how smart you really are. Texts. Receipts. Phone logs. Even the way she changed her password to something I cracked in 12 minutes. Because she used the name of her favorite wine. And the year we met. Like betrayal needs a personal touch. I moved money out of our joint account. Quietly. Methodically. One transfer at a time. Like I was painting my way out of a prison. And she didn't even notice. I had the house title signed over to me too. Which required some paperwork. And a very friendly notary. Who asked no questions. And made excellent coffee. She never looked twice at anything I did. Because she thought she was the only one playing the game. And then came the night. She said she had a business dinner. And kissed me on the cheek with a kind of absent-minded grace. Like she was petting a dog she didn't plan on keeping. I waited 10 minutes. Then followed her. Not because I wanted to catch her in the act. But because I needed closure. The kind that doesn't come in therapy. Or whiskey. Or late-night phone calls to friends who tell you you'll be okay. When you know you won't. She didn't go to a restaurant. She went to a hotel. Room 509. I didn't go inside. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just stood in the parking lot. With the engine running. And a look on my face that said, "This is the last time you make me feel like I'm losing my mind." And I smiled. Not because it was funny. But because sometimes when a man loses everything. He starts to find himself again. That night I didn't sleep. Not because I couldn't. But because I didn't want to miss the way the world felt when it was honest. When it didn't try to pretend that love was forever. Or that good men get rewarded just for being good. I sat in the kitchen. drinking coffee that tasted like resolve, watching the sun come up, like a curtain slowly pulling back on a stage that had seen too many lies, and not enough truth. She came home just before sunrise, wearing the same outfit she'd left in. Her hair mussed just enough to raise questions, but not enough to raise alarms. If you were the kind of man who still wanted to believe. I wasn't. She made small talk about the dinner that didn't happen, and how Frank from accounting had too much wine, and told a story about Cancun. And I nodded, because it's amazing how creative people get when they're building their own gallows. I slid an envelope across the table, while she stirred cream into her coffee, the way she always did, clockwise, 5 times, like superstition was her only real religion. She looked at the envelope, then looked at me, like she was trying to place my face, like maybe I was a new character in a story she hadn't prepared for. "What's this?" she asked, and her voice was still soft, still sweet, still laced with the perfume of a woman who didn't expect to lose. "Open it," I said. She did. Her hands trembled just slightly when she saw the papers, because even liars get nervous when the game ends before they're ready to lose. Divorce papers, signed, sealed, and copied 3 times, because I don't do things halfway. Not anymore. She opened her mouth, probably to lie, or to cry, or to say something that would make it seem like I was the villain in her fairy tale gone wrong. But I stopped her with a sentence I'd rehearsed in my head for weeks. "I already know everything, and I'm done." She blinked, like someone turning on a light switch in a room they thought was empty, and finding the truth standing there, holding a hammer. And for a moment there was silence. Not the comfortable kind that couples share in the dark, but the kind that tells you this chapter is over, and the next one doesn't have your name on it. She left that morning, without packing a bag, just walked out, like the air inside our house had become too heavy to breathe, and maybe it had. I sat in that kitchen for another hour, staring at the envelope she hadn't taken with her, wondering how long she'd been gone before I noticed. People say healing starts with forgiveness, but I think it starts with honesty. The kind that doesn't flinch when it looks in the mirror. The kind that doesn't need someone else's permission to move on. So I did. I emptied our closet into black garbage bags, donated her favorite sweaters to a shelter, changed the locks, had the alarm system reprogrammed, and told the neighbors she'd moved out of state, which was only a lie in terms of geography. And when I was done, I stood in the middle of my living room and realized something strange. The house felt bigger, not because there was less furniture or fewer clothes, but because the weight was gone. The invisible weight of pretending everything was fine, when it wasn't. I went to therapy, not because I needed someone to fix me, but because I wanted to make sure I didn't carry her ghost into the next chapter. And I started a business, not out of revenge, but because I'd always dreamed of working with my hands, instead of just keeping them folded in my lap, waiting for a woman to come home to me. Now I make things, furniture mostly, and there's something poetic about turning raw material into something sturdy, something beautiful, something that doesn't fall apart when you stop looking at it. And then I met someone, not on purpose, not with intent, just in passing, the way storms pass, and leave behind clearer skies. She smiled like she meant it, and asked questions like she wanted to know the answers, not just confirm her suspicions. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Emily called once, said she made a mistake, said she missed me, said things like, "We can still fix this," and "Remember what we had." But I don't do reruns. Some movies are only good the first time, and even then you realize later, the acting wasn't as good as you thought. There's a peculiar kind of freedom that comes when you realize the worst already happened, and you survived it. When the storm tears your house down, and you find yourself standing in the rubble, with breath in your lungs, and nothing left to fear, because what more could the sky possibly take? That's where I lived for a while, in that quiet, strange place. After Emily left, people asked how I was doing, with tilted heads, and voices soft, like they were speaking to someone who had just escaped a fire. and didn't know it yet. But I always told them the same thing. I'm rebuilding. And I was. Not just the furniture business, which started as a side project in my garage, and somehow became something people were willing to pay for, but myself too, in ways I didn't know were possible. Before everything fell apart, there was this moment I remember clear as day, maybe 3 months after the papers were filed, when I was sanding down a cherrywood slab for a client's dining table, and I caught myself humming, not out of habit, but because I felt good, really good, not performatively, not with a forced smile, but deep down, where the music lives. That's when I knew I was back. Not the same version of me that got blindsided by love wearing a mask, but someone sharper, someone slower to trust maybe, but wiser for it, someone who knew what to look for in the eyes of a person pretending they hadn't broken anything. Emily was still a ghost in my phone, a contact I didn't delete right away, not because I hoped she'd call again, but because there was something empowering about knowing I didn't need to block her. She did call again though, once in the fall, when the leaves were changing, and so was I, and I let it go to voicemail. She said she'd been thinking about us, and how maybe we rushed into things, and maybe we let small things get too big, and maybe, always maybe, there was still something worth salvaging. If only we both tried. And I sat there, listening to her voice spill out of the speaker, like a sales pitch for a product I'd already returned. And I realized I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not longing, just distance, and clarity, and a quiet thankfulness that I didn't pick up, because I'd already learned the truth about women like Emily. They don't miss you. They miss the version of themselves they got to be, when you loved them without questions. When your belief in them was so total, it made them feel immortal. And when that disappears, when the applause stops, and the stage lights go out, they don't grieve the relationship. They grieve the audience. I kept working. I started waking up early, not out of necessity, but because the mornings were mine again, quiet, and slow, and uncomplicated. I drank my coffee with the sunrise, and no one to explain myself to, and for the first time in years, felt like I was living for me. Then one day a letter arrived. Not from Emily, but from her new boyfriend, the one I'd seen in the photo, the one with the smug smile, and the oblivious grip on her hand. He wanted to meet, said there were things I needed to know. Now I'm not a man easily intrigued by drama, but something about the phrasing made my hands go still over the blueprint I was sketching, and my heart take one slow heavy beat. So I met him, neutral ground of course, a diner out by the interstate, where anonymity and burnt coffee are the house specialties. He looked different in person, smaller, not physically, but in energy, like the kind of guy who thought charm was the same as character, until the world taught him otherwise. He ordered pancakes with too much syrup, and apologized for what he was about to say. Turns out Emily had been telling him stories too, stories that didn't line up with mine, or with each other. And now that they were unraveling, he needed clarity, not for closure, but for survival, because she'd drained his accounts, maxed out his cards, used his name to sign a lease on a car he didn't drive, and then disappeared. He was left with debt collectors, and silence, and a long list of lies dressed as reasons. I didn't laugh, didn't gloat, didn't say I told you so, because that's not who I am. I just stirred my coffee, and said, "Yeah, that sounds like her." And he asked if I had advice, and I told him the same thing I'd tell any man in his shoes. You can't fix people who don't want to be fixed, and you can't save someone who sees your love as a ladder. Sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away, and never look back, not because you're weak, but because you're finally strong enough to stop bleeding. For someone who brought their own knife. He nodded, and paid for both our meals, which felt like a gesture of apology, and maybe gratitude too, and I left the diner lighter than I walked in, because sometimes the universe shows you exactly who someone is, not to hurt you, but to set you free. You'd think by the fourth act of a story like this, the chapters would start to feel predictable, But life has a way of saving its sharpest edges for the moments you're not looking. And it was right around the time I thought the storm had passed that I realized some clouds don't drift. They circle. Started with a knock on my shop door, just after closing, on a Tuesday evening, the kind of knock that carries a certain weight. Like the person behind it isn't just asking to come in, but to rewrite something. I opened the door, and there she was, Emily, wearing that same tan coat she always wore, when she was trying to look casual but important, and holding a Tupperware container. Like that somehow made it normal. I stared at her, and she smiled. That practiced smile. The one I used to believe in, because I wanted to, not because I should have. I made something for you, she said, just like that, like she hadn't lit a match, and walked away from everything we were. It's lasagna, she added, and I almost laughed, because that was the meal she used to make when we had friends over, so they'd think everything was fine. I let her in, not because I wanted to, but because curiosity is a powerful thing, and I needed to hear what version of the truth she was going to sell me now. She looked around the shop, and made small talk about the smell of wood, and how she always knew I'd end up building something beautiful. You always had the hands for it, she said, and I felt something old and sharp stir in my chest, because those were the kinds of compliments that used to mean something, before I learned what her approval was really worth. We sat down, and she unpacked the food, like we were still married, like this was just another evening, where forgiveness was expected, and the past had an expiration date. I didn't eat. I asked her why she was here, and she didn't answer at first, just looked at the sawdust on my jeans, and the new calluses on my hands, like maybe she thought time would freeze, while she figured out what version of herself to wear. Then she said she missed me, not in the movie kind of way, where someone realizes they gave up on love too early, but in the hollow, desperate way of someone who's run out of places to land. She talked about regret, and growth, and therapy, and how she'd started volunteering at a shelter, and how maybe this was fate giving us a second chance. She reached for my hand. I didn't take it. I just looked at her, and said quietly, "I already let you go." She blinked, like I'd spoken in a language she didn't understand, and maybe I had, because people like Emily don't process rejection the way the rest of us do. They think love is a light switch, and that coming back should make the room warm again. She asked if there was someone else, and I told her no, which was technically true, because I wasn't looking for someone else. I was learning to be someone else. She stood up after that, carefully placing the lasagna back into the container, like the gesture still meant something. And then she said the line, "You'll regret this." And I told her the only thing I regretted was not seeing her clearly sooner. She left without slamming the door, which was fitting, because she never broke things with sound, only silence and slow erosion. That night I didn't dream about her. I dreamed about the beach, just waves, an open sky, and the feeling of walking barefoot toward something that didn't require me to shrink. The next morning I threw the lasagna in the trash, without opening it, because closure doesn't come in reheated form, and I wasn't interested in tasting old lies, dressed as new effort. And then the letters started, not from her, but from a lawyer. Apparently Emily had discovered that I'd moved our joint assets before the divorce, and wanted to challenge the division, claiming I'd manipulated the process. It was laughable on paper, but it still meant depositions, and emails, and courtrooms, and seeing her name show up in places I'd finally cleared her from. My lawyer, sharp guy named Roy, with a mustache that meant business, told me not to worry. "She's reaching," he said. "Desperate people grab at anything when they're falling." But it didn't stop the headaches, didn't stop the way I flinched when I saw her name on my phone. Even if it was just a calendar reminder, I forgot to delete. Healing isn't a straight road. It's a gravel path, with potholes, and bad weather, and days where the sun shines just long enough to make you believe again, before the clouds roll in. But I kept walking, kept building, kept waking up to a life that didn't include her voice in the background. pretending it was a melody. And I realized something important. You don't need revenge. You need peace. You need mornings without anxiety, and dinners that taste like home, and someone who smiles at you, without rehearsing it first. And while I didn't have all of that yet, I had something close. I had quiet, and I was learning to love it. There's a moment in every man's life when he realizes peace doesn't come when the battle ends. It comes when he decides he's not fighting anymore. And for me, that moment came one Thursday morning, while I was sweeping the shop floor, and found her earring under a stack of pine planks. Like some forgotten artifact from a life I no longer belonged to. It was small, gold, delicate, the kind she wore when she wanted to look effortless. And I stared at it like it might whisper something useful. But all it gave me was silence, the kind that's louder than any scream. I tossed it in the trash, without hesitation, and went back to work. Because closure isn't about understanding why someone hurt you. It's about realizing it doesn't matter anymore. But Emily wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The legal nonsense dragged on longer than it needed to, because she kept finding new ways to stall, new angles to push, new stories to spin. And every time I thought we were nearing the finish line, she'd drop another delay, like a magician pulling handkerchiefs from her sleeve. She claimed she'd signed the divorce papers under duress, that she hadn't been mentally sound when she agreed to the settlement, that I'd exploited her emotional state with premeditated precision. Her lawyer called it an imbalance of power and timing. Mine called it desperation dressed in legalese. But I called it exactly what it was. Another attempt to stay tethered to a life she no longer deserved. I started having headaches again. The kind that feel like someone is whispering doubt directly into the base of your skull. And for the first time in months, I felt the edge of rage rising again, like smoke from a fire I thought I'd put out, because I hadn't just moved on. I'd rebuilt. I'd carved a business from the wreckage of our marriage. I'd shaped new habits, new routines, new mornings that didn't start with lies and end with questions. And I wasn't about to let her rewrite that chapter. So I did what I do best. I got to work. I started documenting again, not because I needed more evidence, but because some part of me needed the ritual, the control, the clarity of details laid out, like nails on a workbench, phone records, screenshots, emails, timestamps, text logs. Every passive-aggressive message she sent now joined the pile. And I watched as her own contradictions began to trip over each other, like drunks at a masquerade. And still I stayed quiet, because the loudest message a man can send is to keep building, while someone else is trying to tear things down. And then one evening, my neighbor Carol stopped me on the sidewalk. Older woman, sharp eyes, voice like gravel and warm bread. And she said the words that made my pulse go cold. She's been by the house. I asked who, and she just raised her eyebrows, like I was playing dumb. Emily. Apparently she'd stopped by twice during the week, when she thought I was at work, asking about me, in the kind of voice that pretends it's casual, but trembles at the edges. And that's when it clicked. She wasn't just trying to win in court. She was trying to haunt the place she used to own, trying to get under my skin, not with apologies this time, but with presence. With reminders, with footsteps on sidewalks she no longer had the right to walk. So I did what any man with something to protect would do. I put up cameras, not to catch her, but to remind myself she wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't a mystery, or a puzzle, or a what if. She was a ghost, with nowhere to haunt. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to calm, because control isn't about power. It's about preparation. It's about knowing the locks are changed, and the lights still come on, and the past can knock all it wants, but it doesn't have a key. Then something unexpected happened. An envelope arrived, not from a lawyer, or a bank, or anyone official, just a plain white envelope, slid through my mail slot, like a whisper. Inside was a photo, me and Emily, on our wedding day. She'd written nothing on it. But the image said everything. We were smiling under a string of paper lanterns, in my uncle's backyard, and I was looking at her, like she was the finish line of a race. I didn't know I'd already lost. I stared at that photo for a long time, not because I missed her, but because I missed the man in the picture, the one who still believed. And that's when I knew. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about making sure I never became the kind of man who let betrayal define his story. So I put the photo back in the envelope, taped it shut, and tossed it in the fireplace, watched it curl into ash, not out of anger, but because I don't need reminders of a chapter one already lived and survived. Sometimes you don't notice healing when it happens all at once. You only feel it in pieces, in the little things, like the way coffee starts tasting like comfort again, or how music you once avoided becomes background noise, instead of a knife in your chest. That was where I lived now, somewhere between recovery and revelation, somewhere quiet, where the air was heavier, but the silence was mine. Emily's legal games had stalled, but not stopped. Her last attempt had fizzled out in court. When her new lawyer realized her evidence amounted to a handful of texts, taken wildly out of context, and a claim that I'd manipulated her with kindness, the judge wasn't impressed. Neither was I, but it still wore on me, having to sit across a table from her, with her new haircut and her old tricks, hearing her speak about our marriage, like it was a transaction gone wrong, like I was a salesman who promised more than I delivered. And maybe that's what I'd done in her eyes. Maybe I'd promised a life she thought would feel like a movie, and instead gave her a real one, with dishes, and mortgages, and Tuesdays where nothing happened. But I never lied. I never cheated. I never stopped showing up, until the day I realized I was the only one still in the room. And then one afternoon a letter arrived. This one wasn't legal. It wasn't even signed. Just one typed paragraph. On plain white paper. I saw her with someone else before she left you. More than once. If you're wondering when it really started, try February. There was no return address. No explanation. Just the unsettling clarity of truth. Slipped between two folds of paper. Now I'd always suspected the timeline was messier than she claimed. But seeing it confirmed by a stranger felt like finding footprints in a locked room. And it bothered me. Not because I wanted to confront her, or get revenge, but because it proved how long she'd been gone before she told me, which meant I'd been loving a memory, while she'd been rehearsing her exit. Still, I folded the letter, and set it aside, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't change anything. What I did next, though, that changed everything. There's a little hardware store on the edge of town, where I buy most of my materials. And there's a cashier there named Dana. She's not flashy, doesn't wear perfume that fills the room, doesn't pretend to be more than she is. She just smiles like it means something, and asks about my projects, like they matter. And that day, I asked her if she wanted to grab a coffee sometime. Nothing dramatic, just a simple question, with no agenda, no plan, no wait. She said yes, and for the first time since the sky fell, I didn't feel like I was trying to fill a space. I felt like I was starting something new. We met at this little cafe by the river, with mismatched mugs, and a menu written in chalk. And I told her the short version of everything, not to scare her off, but because I didn't want to wear a mask again. And she listened, not with sympathy, but with understanding. She told me about her divorce, 5 years back, how she found herself rebuilding a life. One weekend at a time, how she learned to be alone, before she remembered how to be with anyone again. We talked for hours, and when it ended I didn't feel a spark. I felt something better, a calm, a space where things could grow, if they wanted to. And as I walked back to my truck, I realized something. Emily didn't break me, she revealed me. She didn't steal my peace. She reminded me why it mattered. And when I got home that evening, I walked through my house, and it felt full, not with furniture, or noise, or the echo of old arguments, but with the kind of quiet that tells you, you've made it through the hardest part. There was no ceremony, no grand epiphany, just me, in the doorway of a home I built with my own hands, and the knowledge that the war was over. I had survived, not as the man I was, but as the man I was always supposed to be. I used to think endings were loud, that they came with final words, or slammed doors, or some cinematic collapse that leaves you breathless. But in reality, endings are quiet. They happen in between moments, like when you stop checking your phone, or when you forget to mention her name in conversation. That's how it ended for me, not with a crash, but with a calm. Emily faded, like smoke from a candle that had burned too long, and I didn't chase her, or curse her, or even wonder what she was doing, because that chapter closed itself. I didn't need to slam it shut. I just let the pages stop turning. The business kept growing, piece by piece, table by table, and it became something more than income. It became identity, and I was proud, not because of how far I'd come, but because of how steady I'd become. Steady like oak, not flashy, not loud, just solid. And Dana, well, Dana stuck around. She never asked for more than I was ready to give. Never made me feel like I was on trial. Never treated my scars like a project. She just showed up, consistently, and one night, while we were walking by the river, and the sky was painted in that summer orange, that makes everything feel possible. I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of love, not of loss, not of the quiet that comes when you finally let go of everything that tried to unmake you. We didn't talk about the past much. She knew enough, and I didn't need to relive it, because sometimes the best thing about surviving something ugly is that you no longer feel the need to explain it. You just carry the lessons and leave the wreckage. Then one afternoon, as I was closing up the shop, I saw something that made me pause. Across the street, at the pharmacy, Emily stood alone, holding a prescription bag, staring into her phone, like the screen might offer her a map back to something lost. She didn't see me, and I didn't call out. She looked tired, not in the physical sense, but in that way people look when the game doesn't work anymore, when charm starts to feel like effort, and the mask doesn't fit like it used to. For a second I wondered if she was happy. Then I realized it didn't matter, because I was. I turned and walked back inside the shop, let the door shut behind me with a soft click, and went back to finishing a walnut coffee table for a client who had just moved into their first home. And as I smoothed the edges and wiped away the dust, I smiled, not because I won, but because I stopped playing. Later that night, Dana asked me what I thought the secret was, the secret to surviving something like betrayal, and I told her the truth. You stop trying to rewrite the past and start building a future that has no room for it. You stop measuring yourself against what broke you and start creating something that can't be broken. You get better, not out of spite, but out of peace. And she nodded and reached for my hand, and for once, I didn't pull away, because sometimes the best revenge isn't a comeback, or a confrontation, or a clever line delivered at just the right moment. Sometimes the best revenge is healing and moving on without ever looking back.